A funny way to fish. I've met a lot of eccentric characters in my travels, but never anyone like Reed Rosenthal. I first met him up on the Jefferson River and immediately knew he was a bit quirky. But he was an avid fisherman, so we got along. Anyway, one day the crazy old cowboy asked if I'd like to go on a little fishing trip over near the Big Hole. He said he knew of a secret spot with the biggest fish in the entire state. Well, Montana is known for big trout, and my middle name is Big Fish, so I gladly accepted the offer. Reed picked me up at the Ruby Oxbow Ranch the next morning around dawn, and that's when things started getting a little strange. He took one look at my fly rod and vest and said, "You won't be needing those today." He then marched right into the barn, leaving me there scratching my head. A few minutes later, he came back out carrying two old, hand-tooled leather western saddles, along with some strange-looking tack. Reed threw the saddles in the back of the old Scout and said, "Get in." As soon as I'd closed the door, Reed had the wheels spinning and a rooster tail of dust spraying from the tires. Nothing was said as Reed slowly drank his coffee, while driving at a death-wish pace down the old gravel road. After sitting there for several minutes holding on for dear life, finally I said, "I thought we were going fishing." Reed just replied, "We are." "Then why didn't we bring our fishing gear? And what are the saddles for?" He just smiled and said, "You'll see." And down the road we sped, grasshoppers jumping for cover like the parting of the Red Sea. An hour later, after opening a few gates, we came to a slightly miscalculated skidding stop into some bushes near an irrigation ditch. From the lay of the land and the line of trees, I could tell we were not far from the river. Reed downed the last of his coffee, jumped out, and fought his way through the brush before grabbing the two saddles out of the back. He then said, "Here, use this one," and swung a saddle into my chest. By this time, I was more than a little curious and started questioning Reed's mental health. I'd always known he was a taco short of a combo plate, but this escapade took the cake. I then started to laugh, assuming this was some elaborate practical joke. Well, Reed ignored my inquiries and just stormed off. With the queer-looking harnesses over his shoulder and a saddle in one hand, he plunged into the heavy brush. Left with no choice, I followed, staggering along with the heavy saddle, wondering what might come next on this wild snipe hunt. We crossed the main flow of the Beaverhead on a rickety wooden bridge, and that was the last sign of civilization we saw for the rest of the day. Reed then headed straight for a thicket, before disappearing into the dense undergrowth. When I caught up, he was waiting for me at a wall of pines so tall and thick there was barely any light. Swinging a branch aside, he revealed a trail that could only have been created by wild animals, or a wood elf. After a long walk through the shadows, the trail abruptly ended right at the base of vertical cliff. Reed gave me a minute to catch my breath, and then ducked into a slender crevasse in the rock I hadn't noticed. Following, I found myself in a thin corridor with smooth walls and a sandy floor. The only light came from a sliver of sky hundreds of feet overhead. As we wound our way through the crevasse, my eyes adjusted to the light and began noticing the walls were decorated with thousands of strange, hand-painted petroglyphs. At that point, I realized Reed must have found some ancient mystical place used only by shaman. After a long march of a mile or two, the steep walls suddenly ended, and we stepped out into a lush green glade. This new hidden oasis was filled with thick ferns, strange trees, and flora I had never seen before. The landscape looked like something out of a fairy tale, or Star Trek. Amazed, I followed Reed down a path until we got within earshot of running water. He then crouched and started inching forward quietly. Turning, he gave me two quick hand signals, one a finger to his lips, and the other a palm-down sign to stay low. I followed as best I could, but it was no easy task to be stealthy while carrying that heavy saddle. A moment later, I'd reached the river's edge and Reed yanked me down by the saddle from a hiding place under a tree. He looked at me with stern eyes and wrinkled brow, letting me know I was making too much noise. He then nodded his head toward the river. At first I didn't see what he was trying to show me. Then, when I did, I couldn't believe my eyes. In a deep, slow-moving pool not 15 feet away, there was a pod of brown trout bigger than any I had ever seen in my life. I swear these fish were the size of hippos, each at least 10 feet long. As I watched, the dozen or so whale-sized browns took turns rhythmically rising, gulping huge mouthfuls of swirling caddis, each bug the size of a duck. I gasped in shock. Then, in a barely audible whisper, Reed said, "Throw the saddle over the fish right in front of the dorsal fin. Jump on, and when the fish lurches forward, swing the bit into its mouth with both hands. Naturally, I gave him a, "You've got to be kidding" look, but he ignored me and said, "You take the one furthest back and I'll take the next one upstream." Without any further instructions, Reed slid silently from under the trees and into the river, giving me another hand signal to sweep around towards the back of the pod. I stuffed the harness in my teeth like a pirate, weighted the saddle in both hands, shrugged, and started off as quietly as I could toward my quarry. When we were both in position, behind and to the left of the upstream-facing fish, Reed signaled and swung his saddle in a fluid motion onto the back of the lead fish. I only hesitated a second before attempting the same maneuver. Unfortunately, just as I threw the saddle, the huge fish moved forward and the saddle landed closer to the tail than the dorsal fin. I dove for the saddle and landed on my stomach with a thud, my head and arms on one side of the saddle, my legs on the other, with my rump stuck in the air. Well, that's when all hell broke loose. The fish flipped its massive tail in the saddle, my rump and the rest of me were sent straight up for 10 or 12 feet. As I looked down, the fish submerged deep into the river and disappeared, and I dropped like a rock. The saddle hit the water, I hit the saddle, and I sank 8 or 9 feet through the clear water before settling softly on the bottom. I landed standing, holding the saddle, with bubbles floating up from my mouth and nose, and frowning. There was nothing else to do, so I hoisted the saddle up to my chest and began the laborious task of marching out of depths. Holding my breath, it was difficult to climb out of that river hole with the current and slippery rocks. When I finally broke the surface, my lungs were ready to burst and I splashed and stumbled, until flopping down in the shallows near the shore. Looking around, darn if it wasn't like being stung by a bee when I saw old Reed Rosenthal, 100 yards upstream, hooting and hollering as he rode a trout as big as a Brahma bull in a rodeo. It was jumping and bucking across the river, while Reed shouted and waved his cowboy hat. He fought that trout just like he'd been breaking a free-range pony, and gradually the fish began to tire. Once the trout had given in, Reed pulled on the reins, gave it a little boot heel, and got that fish to turn back downstream. A minute later, he glided right up to where I was sitting, just like he was riding a Harley. Reed took one look at me and started to laugh. I must have been a pretty sorry sight, dripping wet from head to toe, and still gasping for air. Once he'd gotten his laughter under control, he said, "Get on. We'll use this one to find another pod." It wasn't difficult to put my saddle on that dog-tired trout. Reed had ridden him hard. However, as soon as I climbed on its back, the big fish dug into some secret reserve of survival spunk and started jumping and bucking like today was going to be his last. Reed calmly turned his head and said, "Hold on." Then that damn fish jumped, bucked twice, slammed down sideways, came up, and did a tail walk 50 yards across the river, jumped high, then dove deep into a hole where it came to a complete and sudden stop. The hole was so deep that Reed and I were left sitting there on our saddles with our heads about a foot below the surface. After a few seconds of the river slowly drifting by, I murmured, "Now what?" Reed grunted something and jerked on the reins and finally got the fish to move towards the surface. At first, our hats broke the surface and then our heads, but that was as far as the fish would rise. It was a strange sensation riding that big trout upstream, with just our heads out of the water. Fortunately, by now, most of the fight had been knocked out of the fish and Reed urged it on with a few light kicks. We hadn't traveled 200 yards when Reed pulled hard on the right rein and guided the fish over towards shore. He dismounted in a swoop, sliding his saddle off as he did. The fish then turned toward deeper water, and I finally slid off, which left me in neck-deep water. Reed then nodded upriver where I immediately saw an even larger pod of trout, these twice the size of the last. There must have been 20 of the mutant monsters, all slurping down tons of the ridiculously large caddis. Climbing out of the river, we quietly crept into the cover of the trees and began sneaking up on the unsuspecting fish. When we got closer, we settled into the bushes, and Reed told me his new strategy. His plan called for me to climb a tree along the river, shinny out on a branch hanging over the river, and drop down on one of the big fish from above. Needless to say, I was a little hesitant, but somehow Reed persuaded me that it was the right thing to do. He claimed he had landed a big one using the very same technique, in the very same spot, not more than a week earlier. As I shimmied up the tree, my opinion of Reed's plan changed from mere skepticism to preposterous. I was wearing the saddle like a horse, and I had the reins around my neck, so I could have both hands free to climb. When I got to the junction of the trunk and branch, things got awkward. As I started crawling out onto the limb, the saddle shifted and I was pulled around to the underside of the branch in a sudden swirl. Hanging upside down, holding on for dear life, I could hear Reed's muffled hysteria in the bushes below. Fortunately, the fish didn't notice, and I inched further out on the limb as the branch slowly bent towards the river. When I got to a point directly over the nearest monster trout, I hooked both knees over the branch and hung upside down like a trapeze artist. I then took the saddle, held it over the back of the nearest trout's back, took aim, and tried to visual the acrobatic stunt I was about to attempt. With blood rushing to my head, I took a deep breath and then let go. Amazingly, I executed a perfect half flip and landed on the saddle squarely on the horse-sized trout's back, right in front of his dorsal fin. I hit hard, so expected the fish to go berserk like a bull out of a rodeo chute, but nothing happened. I looked over at Reed, and he motioned for me to loop the harness into the fish's mouth. But the fish didn't even raise its head. It didn't even budge. I put my boots in the stirrups, wiggled myself into the saddle, and prepared the harness, but the fish still just sat there. Once more I looked over at Reed, who was now standing at the river's edge not 10 feet away with a big knowing smile on his face. Then, in a somewhat humorous tone, he said, "That particular fish is unusually large even for this river." That's when I realized the fish I was sitting on was much larger than the huge fish Reed had landed earlier. My best estimates made it about the same size as a full-grown humpback whale. With a sudden feeling of trepidation, and without looking over, I asked Reed meekly, "Do you know this fish personally?" He answered with a laugh, "Yes, sir, I do." "Did you have any luck with this fellow?" I asked. He laughed agin and responded, "No, sir, I did not." I moaned, as I remembered the first and last time I lowered myself onto the back of a wild bronco. When it happened, I still wasn't prepared for the sudden strength and fury of that massive aquatic mutation. The fish lunged. All I could do was grab the saddle horn and hold on. The cold water cut off my scream as the fish dove deep. I hoped Reed would retrieve my dislodged hat. A funny thought to have as water swirled so fast and furiously around me it felt like the backwash of a jet engine. Well, the ride was over quickly. The fish came completely out of the water in a high vaulting arc. I was soaring 15 feet above the river and momentarily had a feeling of exhilaration. For an instant, I even thought I had a chance of landing the beast. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, a branch caught me right in the midsection. All the air was forced out of my lungs with a whoosh, and the huge trout left me hanging on a branch about 12 feet above the river. The whole ride didn't take 10 seconds. Draped over the branch like laundry hung out to dry, the saddle hanging straight down with my boots still in the stirrups. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't talk and I couldn't move. In leaving, the fish splashed the water with such force a huge plume of icy water gushed into my face, as if I'd stuck my head into Old Faithful. I alternated between coughs and gasps, still unable to move. When I finally did, it was a feeble effort to slowly slide off the branch, which was an action I regretted. The saddle hit the water and I caught up to it in an agonizing position, one reminiscent of an old Western comedy. I groaned. My eyes rolled back in my head, and once again, I sank to the river bottom. A few seconds later, Reed pulled me out by my collar and dragged me onto the grass, the saddle still hanging from my feet. When he dropped me, he said, "That looked like it hurt." Blinking, I saw my old lucky hat hanging out to dry on a pine branch. The sight gave me a sense everything was right in the world. Finally able to speak, I let out a feeble laugh and replied, "I nearly had him." It took some time for me to recover, but I survived to try to land one more of those big free-range fish. I didn't have any luck, though. The fish were just too big, too strong, and smart. Nevertheless, I did learn a few lessons, although the education had been some rough schooling. But I knew my day would eventually come, and I'd land a big one. Late that afternoon, I rested in the glade by the river, while Reed was off on some mystical errand, and contemplated the day's experiences. Sitting there in that magical place, I realized it's the journey, and not the destination that is most important, and that just getting out there and trying is what really matters.